William Wallace is celebrated as one of Scotland's greatest national heroes, revered as the leader of the Scottish rebel forces during the formative years of the prolonged struggle to liberate Scotland from English dominion at the close of the 13th century. His legacy is one of unwavering devotion to Scottish independence, embodying the spirit of a nation yearning for freedom. He is more highly regarded than Scottish monarchs, with his name being known worldwide. Much of what we know about Wallace can be traced back to a late 15th century romance titled The Wallace, attributed to Henry the Minstrel, commonly known as Blind Harry. This epic poem is fiercely anti-English in its language and tone, depicting Wallace as a heroic figure fighting against overwhelming odds. Wallace is portrayed as a champion of the common man, striving for liberty against oppression, and in stark contrast to the opportunistic Scottish nobility of his time, who were depicted as collaborators with the English for personal gain. Wallace was a man from humble origins who rose to become the guardian of Scotland, an inspiring general and leader of men. The Scots believed in him, and he was a man of incredible character, unwavering in his beliefs. Unlike the Scottish nobles who colluded with the English for financial rewards, Wallace sought neither personal fame nor material gain, and he acquired neither wealth nor land during the campaigns he fought. His sacrifices were solely made for the freedom and betterment of his homeland. This profound dedication cemented Wallace's legacy as a symbol of national pride and resistance. His story transcends time, being immortalized in the film Braveheart, highlighting some of his achievements and portraying him as a beacon of hope to the Scottish people. Although captured by Edward Longshanks, the King of England, otherwise known as the Hammer of the Scots, even in the face of certain death, Wallace displayed a will of iron, and due to his defiance to the English king, was killed in one of the worst ways possible. This, however, only heightened his legacy, as his death went on to inspire his fellow Scots to gain their independence from tyrannical English rule. This is the story of William Wallace. William Wallace was born around the year 1270 in the historic county of Ayrshire in the southwest of Scotland. His father, Sir Malcolm Wallace, was a minor landowner and knight of modest repute. Wallace was one of 3 sons, having an older brother called Malcolm and a younger sibling named John. As the second son, William did not inherit his father's title or lands, a common fate among younger sons of nobility. Details of Wallace's early life remain sparse and unreliable. It is said that he was raised under the care of his uncle, a priest. As the son of a nobleman, Wallace likely enjoyed a relatively comfortable and tranquil upbringing. He and his brother Malcolm would have trained in the martial disciplines of the time, mastering skills such as horsemanship and swordsmanship. Contemporary chroniclers depict Wallace as a large and powerful figure, reportedly standing over 6.5 feet tall, a giant in an age where the average infantryman was slightly over 5 feet. In these formative years, Wallace's remarkable stature and strength would have set him apart from the average man, preparing him for the turbulent times ahead. His noble upbringing, combined with rigorous martial training and the horrors he would later endure at the hands of the English, would forge a man destined for greatness. Some historians surmise that Wallace must have possessed prior military experience to effectively lead the remarkable campaign he did in the year 1297. The wars waged by Edward I of England in Wales might have presented an opportune training ground for a younger son of a landholder to serve as a mercenary soldier. There is some evidence to support this theory, as Wallace's personal seal bears the insignia of an archer, suggesting he may have fought in Edward's army as an archer. Walter Bower, in his mid-15th century chronicle, provides a vivid description of Wallace. Bower depicts him as a tall man with the body of a giant, with lengthy flanks, broad in the hips, with strong arms and legs, with all his limbs being very strong and firm. This portrayal underscores Wallace's imposing physical presence, which would have been a formidable asset on the battlefield. Blind Harry, in his late 15th century epic poem, takes this even further, claiming that Wallace stood 7 feet tall. Though some descriptions may be embellished, they reflect the enduring image of Wallace as a towering and powerful figure. The notion of Wallace as an archer in Edward's campaigns adds an intriguing dimension to his legend. If true, it implies that Wallace not only gained valuable military experience, but also witnessed firsthand the might and strategies of the English forces. This experience could have been crucial in shaping his own tactics and leadership style during the Scottish resistance. Wallace's towering stature and strength, whether exaggerated or not, contributed to his legendary status. At the time of Wallace's birth, Scotland was long under the prosperous reign of Alexander III. For over 2 decades, Alexander had maintained a period of peace and economic stability, successfully fending off English attempts to assert dominion over Scotland. Meanwhile, across the border, Edward I, famously known as Edward Longshanks, ascended the English throne in the year 1272, 2 years after Wallace's birth. Edward would become a formidable ruler and military leader, participating in the 9th Crusade, conquering Wales, and eventually turning his ambitions towards Scotland. So Wallace would grow up during the reign of Alexander III. However, in the year 1286 he would die after falling from his horse. The heir to the Scottish throne was Alexander III's granddaughter, Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway, and as she was still a child residing in Norway, the Scottish lords established a government of guardians to manage the kingdom's affairs in her absence. Tragically, Margaret fell ill during her voyage to Scotland and died in Orkney in late September of the year 1290. Her untimely death plunged Scotland into a succession crisis, leading to a period known as the Great Cause. This period saw 13 contenders vying for the throne, with the most credible claims coming from John Balliol and Robert Bruce, not to be confused with his grandson Robert the Bruce. With Scotland on the brink of civil war, the Scottish nobility invited King Edward I of England to observe the dispute. Edward, seizing this opportunity, demanded that all the contenders recognise him as their overlord before they would begin the process. In early November of the year 1292, at a grand feudal court, judgment was rendered in favour of John Balliol. Despite not being the closest in blood, he was deemed to have the strongest legal claim. Edward I, however, had no intention of allowing Scotland to remain independent. He systematically undermined John's authority, treating Scotland as a feudal vassal state. Edward demanded homage from John and insisted on military support for his wars in France. This blatant subjugation led the Scots to lose faith in their compromised king. Consequently, the kingdom's leading nobles then took control, forming a council of 12, effectively a new panel of guardians of the country in the year 1295. The council swiftly concluded a treaty of mutual assistance with France, and King John officially in the year 1296 was imprisoned in the Tower of London until he was allowed to go to France in the year 1299, where he would go on to live out the rest of his life. However, enraged by Scotland's treaty with France, Edward would launch an invasion, beginning with the brutal sack of Berwick in the year 1296. This act of aggression marked the commencement of the Wars of Scottish Independence. Berwick was a royal borough and was Scotland's most important trading port, second only to London in economic importance in medieval Britain at that point. It was also the most populated town in Scotland. The defence of the town was led by William the Hardy. However, the English would overwhelm the Scots. An account of the massacre was recorded. It reads, "Edward spared no one, whatever the age or sex, and for 2 days streams of blood flowed from the bodies of the slain. For in his rage he ordered 7,500 souls to be massacred, so that mills could be turned by the flow of their blood." Edward Longshanks believed that his conquest of Scotland was complete when he left the country in the year 1296. However, his confidence proved to be premature, as resistance quickly emerged, spearheaded by Andrew de Moray in the north and William Wallace in the south. The rapid resurgence of opposition was fueled by widespread discontent and disorder that erupted after the English crown sought to extend its dominion over Scotland. English tax collectors began to impose heavy taxes on the Scots, corruptly exploiting the populace to enrich themselves. The Scots would also suffer under English occupation, and there was widespread discontent. Beyond the southeast corner of Scotland, chaos reigned, and defiance against the English surged. According to legend, William Wallace found himself embroiled in a fierce altercation with the local English soldiers in the village of Ayr. Though he fought valiantly and killed several of his assailants, he was eventually overpowered and cast into a dungeon, where he faced a slow and torturous starvation. On the brink of death, sympathetic villagers intervened, nursing him back to health with unwavering care and compassion. As Wallace regained his strength and was freed from his captivity, his resolve only hardened. He gathered a band of local rebels, men who shared his burning desire for freedom, and launched a systematic and ruthless campaign against the despised English occupiers and their Scottish collaborators. Wallace's growing support emboldened him to expand his attacks. By May of the year 1297, and with a force of around 30 men, he exacted a personal vendetta by ambushing and killing the knights responsible for his father's death. This bold act elevated Wallace from a mere outlaw to a formidable local military leader, one who had dared strike down a knight of King Edward. This audacious victory marked a turning point. Wallace was no longer just a rebel. He had become an enemy of the English crown. His name, now synonymous with resistance, echoed across Scotland, inspiring many to rally to his cause. With every skirmish and ambush, Wallace's legacy and legend only grew. His fierce determination and unyielding spirit drove his nation towards the hope of freedom. The absence of a reigning monarch in Scotland exacerbated the situation, plunging the nation into a period of uncertainty and political instability. This vacuum of power allowed fear to fester among the populace, who were increasingly resentful of English rule and the heavy-handed tactics used to enforce it. The year 1297 marked a significant turning point as Scotland erupted into open revolt. Many Scottish nobles, driven by fear and the allure of financial rewards, had initially paid homage to the English king. Their submission, however, only served to deepen the unrest among the common people, who saw their leaders' capitulation as a betrayal of their nation's sovereignty. According to the 15th century poem The Wallace, penned by the enigmatic Blind Harry, a tragic and violent episode played a pivotal role in shaping Wallace's legendary campaign against the English. The poem recounts that William Heselrigg, the Sheriff of Lanark, an agent of the English crown, committed a heinous act by murdering Wallace's beloved wife. This brutal act of cruelty ignited a fierce and bloody thirst for vengeance within Wallace. With his father and wife now dead, Wallace now only lived for revenge against the English crown and for the freedom of his Scotland. Blind Harry vividly describes how Wallace, consumed by grief and rage, exacted his revenge with brutal precision. In a savage act of retribution, Wallace is said to have dismembered Heselrig's body, delivering a grim message of defiance to his oppressors. This bloody act was more than personal vengeance. It was a declaration of war against the English forces occupying Scotland. Thomas Grey, whose father was reportedly present during the tumultuous events. According to Grey, a violent fracas erupted at a court session presided over by Heselrig. Wallace, with aid of a woman who may have been his wife, managed to escape the immediate danger. However, Wallace did not flee far for long. Driven by a relentless desire for justice and retribution, he returned with a band of loyal supporters. In a ferocious attack, Wallace and his men descended upon Heselrig and his entourage. The skirmish was brutal and bloody. Heselrig was slain in the melee, and Thomas Grey's father narrowly escaped death. In the chaos, Wallace's fury was not limited to Heselrig alone. He and his followers set fire to several houses, spreading destruction and warning those who served the English crown. This episode marked a turning point in Wallace's rebellion. The murder of his wife and his subsequent acts of vengeance transformed him from a grieving husband into a relentless warrior for Scottish independence. Following the bloody skirmish at Lanark, William Wallace formed an alliance with William Douglas the Hardy, setting their sights on the city of Scone. Together, they orchestrated a daring raid that would send shockwaves through the English stronghold. Wallace and his men stormed the city with fierce determination, driving out their commander. In wake of their triumph at Scone, the cost of rebellion was becoming painfully evident. Douglas the Hardy was soon captured, falling into the clutches of the English. Yet, this setback did nothing to deter Wallace, fueled by an unquenchable thirst for liberation and vengeance. He pressed on. In the year 1297, Andrew Moray ignited a fierce revolt in northern Scotland, and by late summer, he had seized control of many provinces and even formidable castles. It was in September that William Wallace joined forces with Moray near Dundee, and together they set their sights on Stirling. Stirling, described by Stuart Reid, is traditionally regarded as the key to Scotland. This became a focal point in their campaign. At this juncture, John de Warenne, the Earl of Surrey, had been appointed as the Warden of Scotland by Edward Longshanks. Despite his formidable title, John was now in his late 60s, and he would soon return to England, citing the harsh Scottish climate was detrimental to his health. Nevertheless, the news of the revolts led by Wallace and Moray quickly reached King Edward, who commanded John to crush the Scottish rebellion. The Earl now faced a daunting challenge. His troops were separated from the Scots by a long causeway and a narrow wooden bridge over the River Forth, near Stirling Castle. Recognizing the tactical disadvantage of crossing such a bridge, John hesitated, hoping to delay any confrontation and perhaps seek a diplomatic resolution. On September the 11th, John dispatched emissaries to negotiate with the Scots, but Wallace would defiantly respond, "We are not here to make peace, but to do battle, to defend ourselves and liberate our kingdom." The English army consisted of cavalry and well-trained men-at-arms, and also archers, whereas the Scottish rebel forces consisted of commoners and a few knights rather than nobles, but they were possessed by the spirit of freedom. The narrow bridge, which only allowed 2 horsemen to cross side by side, was the safest crossing point over the river. Wallace and Moray bided their time until as many of the enemy had come over as they believed they could overcome. When approximately 2,000 English troops had crossed, the Scots launched their attack. The Scottish spearmen charged down the high ground, repelling a cavalry charge, and then counter-attacking the English infantry. They swiftly gained control of the east side of the bridge, severing any chance of reinforcements crossing the river. During the battle, Wallace would fight with his 2-handed sword, now remembered to history as the Wallace sword. The blade itself was over 5 feet long, and the entirety of the sword was taller than most Englishmen at the time. This meant only a giant could even wield the sword, marking Wallace's battle renown as he slew countless English soldiers by swinging his 2-handed greatsword in a shower of blood. Trapped on the low ground and with no hope of retreat or support, the outnumbered English soldiers were massacred. The melee was so intense that the bridge, unable to bear the weight of the retreating and advancing soldiers, collapsed, drowning many of the English in the river. Hugh de Cressingham, King Edward's treasurer in Scotland, was killed in the fighting. In a gruesome act of revenge, it is said that his body was flayed and his skin was cut into small pieces as tokens of victory. The Lena Cost Chronicle notes that Wallace had a broad strip of Cressingham's skin taken from the head to the heel to make the baldric for his sword. Earl John, who remained south of the river with a contingent of archers, found his confidence shattered. Despite still having a considerable force, he ordered the destruction of the bridge and retreated, leaving the garrison at Stirling Castle isolated and the lowlands vulnerable to the rebels. Andrew Moray was mortally wounded during the battle and would succumb to his injuries by November. Wallace would capture the castle, which was a pivotal moment for Scotland, as the people now had a greater sense of hope that the English could actually be defeated. After the battle, Wallace would assume the revered title of Guardian of the Kingdom of Scotland. This role, akin to that of a regent, saw him govern in place of the absent king. Wasting no time, Wallace launched a bold invasion into northern England, crossing into Northumberland. The Scottish army pursued the retreating English forces, driving them further south. Trapped between 2 advancing armies, hundreds of refugees sought refuge behind the fortified walls of Newcastle. The Scots laid waste to vast stretches of the countryside, turning westward into Cumberland and pillaging relentlessly. Wallace then led his men back into Northumberland, setting ablaze hundreds of villages in a trail of destruction. Laden with plunder, Wallace and his men then returned from their devastating campaign in England, their coffers filled with English silver and gold. Towards the year's end, in a solemn ceremony, Wallace was knighted, a recognition of his valour and leadership. This momentous event marked the formal acknowledgement of Wallace's pivotal role in Scotland's fight for independence. King Edward would soon learn of the devastating defeat of his army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. In response, he concluded a truce with the French king Philip the Fair, and in October of the year 1297, returning to England on March the 14th of the year 1298, Edward focused on organising a formidable army for his second invasion of Scotland. A council of war convened in the city of York to finalise the invasion plans. All Scottish magnates were summoned to attend, but none appeared, leading Edward to declare them all as traitors. Edward Longshanks would then personally lead his army into Scotland, plundering several regions and recapturing some castles. Despite his efforts, he failed to draw William Wallace into open combat. The Scots, astutely shadowing the English army, aimed to avoid a direct confrontation. They planned to wait until shortages of supplies and money forced Edward to withdraw, at which point they would harass his retreat. However, Edward received intelligence that the Scots were encamped nearby at Falkirk. Seizing the opportunity, he swiftly moved to engage them in a pitched battle, which he had long desired. This manoeuvre set the stage for a decisive confrontation between the English and Scottish forces. The English had around 15,000 men, whereas the Scots only had around 6,000, giving the English the numerical advantage. In the year 1298, the Battle of Falkirk was waged, marking a pivotal moment in the struggle between Scotland and England. The Scots bowmen, brave yet outmatched, stood their ground, but were swiftly overrun by the relentless charge of the English cavalry. The Scots found themselves unable to retreat or advance. The battle was lost almost as soon as the first arrows began to rain down upon them. The English, adhering meticulously to their king's command, waited until the Scottish ranks were sufficiently thinned out and disordered. Once the Scots' formations were fragmented, the English cavalry and infantry launched a decisive attack on the wavering spearmen, causing them to break and scatter in disarray. The Scottish forces suffered heavy casualties, and though Wallace managed to escape, his military reputation was severely tarnished. The devastating defeat at Falkirk compelled Wallace to resign his position as Guardian of Scotland, passing the mantle to Robert the Bruce. Though Wallace resigned his leadership and guardianship of Scotland, he still represented the masses of the people, hence Edward's determination to capture at all costs the man who was in himself the embodiment of rebellion. He was also a warrior of skill and daring, and was a leader who had won the heart and the imagination of the people. The details of William Wallace's activities following his resignation as Guardian of Scotland are shrouded in uncertainty. However, there is some evidence to suggest that he embarked on a mission to the court of King Philip the Fair of France, seeking assistance for Scotland's struggle for independence. A surviving letter from the French king, dated November the 7th of the year 1300, addresses his envoys in Rome, urging them to support Sir William. This correspondence also hints at William's intention to travel to Rome, though it remains unclear whether he actually did so. By the year 1304, William Wallace had returned to Scottish soil. Still embroiled in relentless skirmishes, his undying commitment to the Scottish cause burned fiercely, inspiring his fellow Scotsmen to engage the English in a brutal type of guerrilla warfare. A marked man, Wallace knew no surrender, and Edward Longshanks, merciless as ever, was willing to forgive other rebels, but not Wallace. In the early days of August of the year 1305, Wallace was finally captured near Glasgow, betrayed by the treacherous Scottish nobleman named John Menteith. This act of betrayal marked the end of Wallace's glorious rebellion. Handed over to Edward's men, Wallace must have known his days were numbered. Instead of a swift death, he was subjected to the grueling torment of a near 400-mile journey to London for a sham trial, the verdict predetermined. Wallace famously argued that he could never be a traitor to Edward, for he had never been Edward's subject. Nevertheless, despite Wallace's sound arguments, he was found guilty of treason and was condemned to one of the worst punishments in the medieval era, to be hung, drawn and quartered. Stripped of his dignity, he was dragged naked behind a horse to the site of his execution. He was hanged, but was brutally cut down before dying. His agony was far from over. His insides were then savagely torn out and burned before his very eyes. His head was then severed from his body, ending his misery, which was then hacked into quarters. To serve as a grim warning against rebellion, Wallace's head was dipped in tar and was mounted on a pike atop London Bridge. His dismembered limbs were dispatched all over the country, so he couldn't be made whole for proper burial. Wallace's brutal end was intended to crush the spirit of rebellion which he had inspired in the hearts of the Scots. Edward I sought to make a statement with Wallace's gruesome demise. Indeed, his death was a reflection of the king's ruthlessness, instilling fear in the hearts of many. But it was not the end of Wallace's dream. In the years that followed, others would rise, fueled by the memory of his sacrifice, to continue the fight to liberate Scotland from Edward's oppressive rule. Almost immediately following Wallace's execution, Robert the Bruce, a nobleman of great ambition and vision, revived the national rebellion. In a bold and decisive move, he claimed the mantle of leadership and was crowned the King of Scotland in the year 1306. Bruce's coronation symbolised renewed hope for Scottish independence and a steadfast refusal to bow to English rule. Under his leadership, the Scots embarked on a relentless campaign to reclaim their homeland, rallying around the memory of Wallace's sacrifice. As Bruce's campaign gained momentum, the shadow of Edward loomed large over the conflict. The English king, known for his ruthless ambition and military prowess, was determined to crush the Scottish rebellion once and for all. However, fate intervened in an unexpected way. On his way to reconquer Scotland, Edward fell ill and died at the age of 68 in the year 1307. His death marked the end of an era of relentless oppression, and under Robert the Bruce, Scotland would eventually re-establish its independence. William Wallace emerged as a pivotal figure in the First War of Scottish independence, his actions igniting the flames of rebellion against English tyranny. By targeting Edward's soldiers and high-ranking officials early on, he demonstrated a fierce and uncompromising resistance that inspired many. Forming a band of dedicated warriors, Wallace fought with unwavering resolve for the hope of a free Scotland. His legacy has been immortalised in history, with his name enduring as a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of liberty. Through his heroism, Wallace shaped the course of Scottish history and played a key role in it remaining an independent kingdom. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to like, subscribe and share, and I'll see you all soon for another History Profile.